Sumer was one of the ancient civilizations and historical regions in southern Mesopotamia, modern-day southern Iraq, during the Chalcolithic and the early Bronze Ages. Although the earliest specimens of writing in the region do not go back much further than c. 2500 BC, modern historians have suggested that Sumer was first permanently settled between c. 5500 and 4000 BC by a non-Semitic people who spoke the Sumerian language. These conjectured, prehistoric people are now called Proto-Euphratians, or Abaidians, and are theorized to have evolved from the Samaria culture of northern Mesopotamia. The Abaidians are assumed by modern-day scholars to have been the first civilizing force in Sumer, draining the marshes for agriculture, developing trade, and establishing industries, including weaving, leatherwork, metalwork, masonry, and pottery. However, some scholars contest the idea of a Proto-Euphratian language or one substrate language. It has been suggested by them and others that the Sumerian language was originally that of the hunter and fisher peoples, who lived in the marshland and the eastern Arabia littoral region, and were part of the Arabian bifacial culture. Reliable historical records begin much later. There are none in Sumer of any kind that have been dated before, and Mebarajsi. Professor Juris Zarans believes the Sumerians were settled along the coast of eastern Arabia, today's Persian Gulf region, before it flooded at the end of the Ice Age. Sumerian civilization took form in the Uruk period, continuing into the Jemdat Nasr and early dynastic periods. During the 3rd millennium BC, a close cultural symbiosis developed between the Sumerians and the Semitic Akkadian speakers, which included widespread bilingualism. The influence of Sumerian on Akkadian is evident in all areas, from lexical borrowing on a massive scale, to syntactic, morphological, and phonological convergence. This has prompted scholars to refer to Sumerian and Akkadian in the 3rd millennium BC as a Sprachbund. Sumer was conquered by the Semitic-speaking kings of the Akkadian Empire around 2270 BC, but Sumerian continued as a sacred language. Native Sumerian rule re-emerged for about a century in the 3rd dynasty of Ur, approximately 2100–2000 BC. But the Akkadian language also remained in use. The Sumerian city of Eridu, on the coast of the Persian Gulf, is considered to have been the world's first city where 3 separate cultures may have fused: that of peasant Abaidian farmers, living in mud brick huts and practicing irrigation; that of mobile nomadic Semitic pastoralists living in black tents and following herds of sheep and goats; and that of fisher folk, living in reed huts in the marshlands, who may have been the ancestors of the Sumerians. Sumer was also the site of early development of writing, progressing from a stage of proto-writing in the mid-4th millennium BC to writing proper in the 3rd millennium BC. Origin of name. The term Sumerian is the common name given to the ancient non-Semitic inhabitants of Mesopotamia, Sumer, by the Semitic Akkadians. The Sumerians refer to themselves as Ug-Sagiga, phonetically Unsangiga, literally meaning the black-headed people, and to their land as Kiengi, meaning place of the noble lords. The Akkadian word Sumer may represent the geographical name in dialect, but the phonological development leading to the Akkadian term Sumeru is uncertain. Hebrew Shinar, Egyptian Sngr, and Hittite Sanha, all referring to southern Mesopotamia, could be Western variants of Shumar, city-states in Mesopotamia. By the late 4th millennium BC, Sumer was divided into about a dozen independent city-states, which were divided by canals and boundary stones. Each was centered on a temple dedicated to the particular patron god or goddess of the city and ruled over by a priestly governor or by a king who was intimately tied to the city's religious rites. The 5 first cities said to have exercised pre-dynastic kingship: Eridu, Tibera, Larsa, Sippar, Shuruppak. Other principal cities: Uruk, Kish, Nippur, Lagash, Girsu, Umma, Hamazi 1, Adab, Mari 2, Akshak 1, Akkad 1, Ising. Minor cities: Kuara, Zabala, Kisara, Marid, Dilbat, Borsippa, Kutha, Zaire, Esnuna, Naga 2. Apart from Mari, which lies full 330 kilometers northwest of Agade, but which is credited in the king list as having exercised kingship in the early dynastic II period, and Naga, an outpost. These cities are all in the Euphrates-Tigris alluvial plain, south of Baghdad in what are now the Babel, Diyala, Warzit, Dhiqar, Basra, Al-Mudhana and Al-Qadishiyah governorates of Iraq. History: the Sumerian city-states rose to power during the prehistoric Ubaid and Uruk periods. Sumerian written history reaches back to the 27th century BC and before, but the historical record remains obscure until the early dynastic III period, the 23rd century BC, when a now deciphered syllabary writing system was developed, which has allowed archaeologists to read contemporary records and inscriptions. Classical Sumer ends with the rise of the Akkadian Empire in the 23rd century BC. Following the Gutian period, there is a brief Sumerian renaissance in the 21st century BC, cut short in the 20th century BC by Semitic Amorite invasions. The Amorite dynasty of Ising persisted until c. 1700 BC, when Mesopotamia was united under Babylonian rule. The Sumerians were eventually absorbed into the Akkadian population. Ubaid period, 5300–4100 BC. Uruk period, 4100–2900 BC. Uruk XIVV, 4100–3300 BC. Uruk IV period, 3300–3100 BC. Jemdet Nasa period, 3100–290 BC. Early Dynastic period, Early Dynastic I period, 2900–2800 BC. Early Dynastic II period, 2800–2600 BC. Early Dynastic Ear period, 2600–2500 BC. Early Dynastic IIIB period, c. 2500–2334 BC. Akkadian Empire period, c. 2334–2218 BC. Gutian period, c. 2218–2047 BC. Ur-III period, c. 2047–1940 BC. Ubaid period. The Ubaid period is marked by a distinctive style of fine-quality painted pottery which spread throughout Mesopotamia and the Persian Gulf. During this time, the first settlement in southern Mesopotamia was established at Eridu, 5300 BC, by farmers who brought with them the Haji Muhammad culture, which first pioneered irrigation agriculture. It appears this culture was derived from the Samarran culture from northern Mesopotamia. It is not known whether or not these were the actual Sumerians who are identified with the later Uruk culture. Eridu remained an important religious center when it was gradually surpassed in size by the nearby city of Uruk. The story of the passing of the Mitui Nana, goddess of Uruk and of love and war, by Enki, god of wisdom and chief god of Eridu, may reflect this shift in hegemony. Uruk period. The archaeological transition from the Ubaid period to the Uruk period is marked by a gradual shift from painted pottery domestically produced on a slow wheel to a great variety of unpainted pottery mass-produced by specialists on fast wheels. The Uruk period is a continuation and an outgrowth of Ubaid, with pottery being the main visible change. By the time of the Uruk period, the volume of trade goods transported along the canals and rivers of southern Mesopotamia facilitated the rise of many large, stratified, temple-centered cities where centralized administrations employed specialized workers. It is fairly certain that it was during the Uruk period that Sumerian cities began to make use of slave labor captured from the hill country, and there is ample evidence for captured slaves as workers in the earliest texts. Artifacts, and even colonies of this Uruk civilization have been found over a wide area, from the Taurus Mountains in Turkey to the Mediterranean Sea in the west, and as far east as central Iran. The Uruk period civilization, exported by Sumerian traders and colonists, had an effect on all surrounding peoples, who gradually evolved their own comparable, competing economies and cultures. The cities of Sumer could not maintain remote, long-distance colonies by military force. Sumerian cities during the Uruk period were probably theocratic and were most likely headed by a priest-king, assisted by a council of elders, including both men and women. It is quite possible that the later Sumerian pantheon was modeled upon this political structure. There was little evidence of institutionalized violence or professional soldiers during the Uruk period, and towns were generally unwalled. During this period, Uruk became the most urbanized city in the world, surpassing for the first time 50,000 inhabitants. The ancient Sumerian king list includes the early dynasties of several prominent cities from this period. The first set of names on the list is of kings said to have reigned before a major flood occurred. These early names may be fictional, and include some legendary and mythological figures, such as Alalim and Dumizard. The end of the Uruk period coincided with the Payura Oscillation, a dry period from c. early dynastic period. The dynastic period begins c. 2900 BC and includes such legendary figures as Enmerkar and Gilgamesh, who are supposed to have reigned shortly before the historic record opens c. 2700 BC, when the now deciphered syllabic writing started to develop from the early pictograms. The center of Sumerian culture remained in southern Mesopotamia, even though rulers soon began expanding into neighboring areas, and neighboring Semitic groups adopted much of Sumerian culture for their own. The earliest dynastic king on the Sumerian king list, whose name is known from any other legendary source, is Echana, 13th king of the first dynasty of Kish. The earliest king authenticated through archaeological evidence is in Mebarajazi of Kish, whose name is also mentioned in the Gilgamesh epic, leading to the suggestion that Gilgamesh himself might have been a historical king of Uruk. As the Epic of Gilgamesh shows, this period was associated with increased violence. Cities became walled, and increased in size as undefended villages in southern Mesopotamia disappeared. First dynasty of Lagash c. 2500–2270 BC. The dynasty of Lagash, though omitted from the king list, is well attested through several important monuments and many archaeological finds. Although short-lived, one of the first empires known to history was that of Enatum of Lagash, who annexed practically all of Sumer, including Kish, Uruk, and Larsa, and reduced to tribute the city-state of Umma, arch-rival of Lagash. In addition, his realm extended to parts of Elam and along the Persian Gulf. He seems to have used terror as a matter of policy. His Stela of the Vultures has been found, showing violent treatment of enemies. His empire collapsed shortly after his death. Later, Lugal-Zagassi, the priest-king of Umma, overthrew the primacy of the Lagash dynasty in the area, then conquered Uruk, making it his capital, and claimed an empire extending from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. He was the last ethnically Sumerian king before the arrival of the Semitic king, Sargon of Akkad. Akkadian Empire c. 2270–2083 BC. The Semitic Akkadian language is first attested in proper names of the kings of Kish c. 2800 BC, preserved in later king lists. There are texts written entirely in Old Akkadian dating from c. 2500 BC. Use of Old Akkadian was at its peak during the rule of Sargon the Great, but even then most administrative tablets continued to be written in Sumerian, the language used by the scribes. Gelb and Westenholz differentiate three stages of Old Akkadian: that of the pre-Sargonic era, that of the Akkadian Empire, and that of the Neo-Sumerian Renaissance that followed it. Akkadian and Sumerian coexisted as vernacular languages for about 1,000 years, but by around 1800 BC, Sumerian was becoming more of a literary language, familiar mainly only to scholars and scribes. Thorkild Jacobson has argued that there is little break in historical continuity between the pre- and post-Sargon periods, and that too much emphasis has been placed on the perception of a Semitic versus Sumerian conflict. However, it is certain that Akkadian was also briefly imposed on neighboring parts of Elam that were previously conquered by Sargon. Gutian period c. 2083 to 2050 BC, Second Dynasty of Lagash c. 2093 to 2046 BC. Following the downfall of the Akkadian Empire at the hands of Gutians, another native Sumerian ruler, Gurdi of Lagash, rose to local prominence and continued the practices of the Sargonide king's claims to divinity. Like the previous Lagash dynasty, Gurdi and his descendants also promoted artistic development and left a large number of archaeological artifacts. Sumerian Renaissance c. 2047 to 1940 BC. Later, the third dynasty of Arundara, Namu and Shulgi, whose power extended as far as northern Mesopotamia, was the last great Sumerian Renaissance, but already the region was becoming more Semitic than Sumerian. With the rise in power of the Akkadian-speaking Semites, and the influx of waves of Semitic Marti who were to found several competing local powers including Ising, Larsa, and Babylon. The last of these eventually came to dominate the south of Mesopotamia as the Babylonian Empire, just as the Assyrian Empire did in the north. The Sumerian language continued as a sacerdotal language taught in schools in Babylonia and Assyria, much as Latin was used in the medieval period, for as long as cuneiform was utilized. Decline. This period is generally taken to coincide with a major shift in population from southern Mesopotamia toward the north. Ecologically, the agricultural productivity of the Sumerian lands was being compromised as a result of rising salinity. Soil salinity in this region had been long recognized as a major problem. Poorly drained irrigated soils, in an arid climate with high levels of evaporation, led to the buildup of dissolved salts in the soil, eventually reducing agricultural yields severely. During the Akkadian and Earth-III phases, there was a shift from the cultivation of wheat to the more salt-tolerant barley, but this was insufficient. And during the period from 2100 BC to 1700 BC, it is estimated that the population in this area declined by nearly 3/5. This greatly upset the balance of power within the region, weakening the areas where Sumerian was spoken, and comparatively strengthening those where Akkadian was the major language. Henceforth Sumerian would remain only a literary and liturgical language, similar to the position occupied by Latin in medieval Europe. Following an Elamite invasion and sack of Ur during the rule of Ibbi Sin, Sumer came under Amorites' rule. The independent Amorite states of the 20th to 18th centuries is summarized as the dynasty of Ising in the Sumerian king list, ending with the rise of Babylonia under Hammurabi c. 1700 BC. Later rulers who dominated Babylonia occasionally assumed the old Sargonic title, King of Sumer and Akkad, such as Tukulti-Ninurta of Assyria after California, 1225 BC. Population. Uruk, one of Sumer's largest cities, has been estimated to have had a population of 50,000–80,000 at its height, given the other cities in Sumer, and the large agricultural population. A rough estimate for Sumer's population might be 0.8 million to 1.5 million. The world population at this time has been estimated at about 27 million. The Sumerians were a non-Semitic people, and spoke a language isolate. A number of linguists believe they could detect a substrate language beneath Sumerian. because names of some of Sumer's major cities are not Sumerian, revealing influences of earlier inhabitants. However, the archaeological record shows clear uninterrupted cultural continuity from the time of the early Ubaid period settlements in southern Mesopotamia. It is speculated by some archaeologists that Sumerian speakers were farmers who moved down from the north, after perfecting irrigation agriculture there. The Ubaid pottery of southern Mesopotamia has been connected via Chogamami transitional ware to the pottery of the Samaria period culture in the north, who were the first to practice a primitive form of irrigation agriculture along the middle Tigris River and its tributaries. The connection is most clearly seen at Tel Awela near Lhasa, excavated by the French in the 1980s. Where 8 levels yielded pre-Ubaid pottery resembling Samaritan ware. According to this view, farming peoples spread down into southern Mesopotamia because they had developed a temple-centered social organization for mobilizing labor and technology for water control, enabling them to survive and prosper in a difficult environment. Others have suggested a continuity of Sumerians from the indigenous hunter-fisher folk traditions associated with the Arabian bifacial assemblages found on the Arabian littoral. The Sumerians themselves claimed kinship with the people of Dilmun, associated with Bahrain and the Persian Gulf. Professor Juris Zarans believes the Sumerians may have been the people living in the Persian Gulf region before it flooded at the end of the last ice age.